Good evening, I'm David Kramer here with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website at weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to our forecast through that means. Check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we have out for the state. You can also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can send us any emails with any questions or concerns for your area at the address below. Starting off, we'll take a quick look at some snow amounts that we had for the Fairbanks area. Now, these are snow totals from Monday morning on the 12th through Thursday morning on the 15th. So that is about a 3-day time period, but we did have quite a few areas with amounts of snow above 10 inches or so. So starting off from ones that we saw from the gauges, the highest that we saw was at the Wickersham Dome trailhead, and that was 14 inches of snowfall in that 3-day period. And then from our actual observers, so thank you for sending in observations, but we did have an observation at 14 Mile Chena Hot Springs Road, and that got up to 14.5 inches. So quite a lot of snow in the Fairbanks area for these last couple days this week. Taking a look now at the watches, warnings, and advisories that we have out, we'll start off in southeast Alaska. So up around the Juneau area, we have a winter weather advisory for snow out, and that is in effect until right around 6 p.m. this evening, so starting to taper down now in that area. Now, a little bit further to the south around Petersburg and Wrangell areas, we do have a winter weather advisory also for snow out for that area. And that's going to be out a little bit longer, out until 9 p.m. tonight, so not quite tapering down as fast as areas further to the north, but only a couple more hours here this evening. Looking up a little bit further to the north, we have several advisories out along the coastline. Starting with the St. Lawrence Island area up through the Bering Strait coastline, we do have a winter weather advisory out for snow and blowing snow in that area. Some stronger winds getting up to around 50 miles per hour. And we do have that out into effect until around noon on Friday. As we move up the coastline towards the Chukchi Sea coastline, that one is going to start around 9 p.m. this evening and going to last until around 9 p.m. on Friday. As we move further into the Kotzebue Sound area, winter weather advisory for blowing snow there as well. And we do have that one specifically for Baldwin Peninsula and Selawik Valley, and that is going to be in effect starting at around 10 p.m. this evening and going until around noon on Friday. As we look a little bit further to the northeast from the Dalton Highway and places further to the east in the northeastern part of the Brooks Range, we do have a winter weather or a winter storm warning out for snow in that area. That is going to start to taper down around 9 p.m. tonight. So taking a look now what's causing all this weather, we can see our main low pressure system out here in the Bering Sea pushing to the north, but its front is swinging across the western part of the state, and that is bringing a lot of snow up in these more northern locations, a lot of winds up with it as well. Behind this system, we can see another one pushing in towards the western Aleutian Islands. That's going to be the next big player out for those western locations. But as we move further to the east, we'll start off in the Panhandle area here. We have a lot of cloud cover coming in with a lot of that snow, but you can see a lot of the drier air clearing out behind it, which is what's going to cause those snow conditions to diminish. And then out over the eastern part of the state, as we watch this loop one more time, we have our cloud cover pushing off as well up there, which is why we're seeing the snow starting to diminish in that northeastern part of the Brooks Range. And that will continue to taper off throughout the evening. So for today's weather, we have high pressure building in over much of mainland Alaska, but we do still have that snow over the eastern portion of the state. And that's going to continue down all the way into the Panhandle. More interior locations are seeing the snow, but as we get further along the coastline, we are seeing more rain out there, a little bit warmer by the water. As we look out further to the west, we have some snow along the coastline with this system that's starting to push in, and behind that some warmer air coming up from the south, starting to transition some of that over to rain. However, behind it, we're still pulling in a lot of colder air from the north and west, and that's bringing in some snow showers to places of the central Bering down in through the Aleutian Islands. Our next system coming up, starting off with snow for the western Aleutian Islands, but is bringing up a lot of warmer air from the south with that system as well. As we move into tonight, we can see that warm air pushing in through the central Aleutian Islands areas, bringing rain to those locations, but further to the north, seeing that more as snow, and then further to the west as well. Behind the cold front, we are going to see some snow out there as well. As we move in towards the west coast of the state with our system that's now pushing through, we're seeing that snow pushing much further into the western part, mainland Alaska, with the heaviest snow more along the coastline through the Bristol Bay area up through the YK Delta, starting to get a little bit of clearing as this high pressure from the south starting to nudge in and starting to push in areas where we're getting all that moisture there. Stability starting to come in and seeing some fog develop along the Kuskokwim Delta coastline later tonight. And as we look up further towards St. Lawrence Island, we are going to see that blowing snow that we talked about, and that's going to be up towards the Kotzebue Sound area as well. Out over the interior part of the state, high pressure dominating. Going to see a lot of fog and stratus develop over areas of the central interior and eastern parts of the interior. But up along the north slope, we are going to see that snow continuing, especially in the evening hours, but diminishing somewhat overnight, especially as we get closer towards morning. Overnight in the Panhandle, much of the snow should have calmed down. We should see a lot clearer skies as this high pressure starts to push in from the central part of mainland Alaska out towards the east, starting to dominate the Panhandle as well. Our system in the Gulf starting to spin up here, and it's going to be right around Kodiak Island and continue on an easterly progression. So as we watch into Friday, that system pushing in, bringing rain not all the way to the Panhandle, but into eastern areas of the Gulf of Alaska. Out over mainland Alaska, high pressure continuing to dominate over much of the state. Some isolated areas of shower with the diminishment of that front that we had pushing into the western part of the state, really starting to taper off now, but some isolated showers with that as it starts to fall apart there over the western part of the state. Some isolated areas of snow in the very far northeastern parts of the state around Kaktovik, but much of the rest of the interior part of the state and north slope going to be pretty dry. As we look out over the Gulf of Alaska, or the Bering Sea, we have our main system out west with its front pushing through the central part of the Bering and Aleutian Islands now, bringing up snow through St. Lawrence Island up towards the Bering Strait area, and then some rain behind that warm front from that strong southerly fetch that we have through the eastern or the central Aleutian Islands. Western Aleutian Islands are going to see that cold easterly, southeasterly flow there with some isolated snow showers in those locations. Then on Saturday, that low's starting to diminish now and stalling out in the northwestern part of the Bering Sea, but still bringing in some snow showers through much of the western and central Aleutian Islands. However, we have a new system that's going to come up into the eastern part of the Bering Sea, bringing a lot more warm air with it, expecting rain along the Alaska Peninsula, transitioning to snow as we get closer towards the Yukon Delta area, and then we are expecting to see more snow along the west coast further to the north towards the Point Hope area. Up towards Barrow, we are going to see some snow up there, but still seeing high pressure dominate much of mainland Alaska, so the interior through the south central and the Panhandle areas should expect to be void of any kind of precip on Saturday. For temperatures, starting with our lows for Friday morning, a little bit warmer down in the Panhandle area, mid to upper 20s for the most part. As we get into mainland Alaska, we can see much of the colder air further to the east, but with those systems bringing in that warmer air, a lot of warmer temperatures along the west coast. So a lot of below zero temps for western parts of Alaska, including the north coastline, and then we have along the west coast of the state, Kotzebue Sound area in the teens, in the 20s through much of southwestern part of Alaska, and in the 30s for much of the Aleutian Islands. For our highs Friday afternoon, getting up to around 40 for the Aleutian Islands. In the Bristol Bay, YK Delta areas, upper 20s to right around 30 degrees, some places pushing freezing. But as we get towards the Seward Peninsula area, mid to upper 20s, and then getting up further to the north, dropping down into the single digits along the central and eastern parts of the north slope. Down into the interior, further west locations are going to be a little bit warmer, getting up to around 20 degrees, but single digits as we get further to the east. South central Alaska should get up into the mid-20s, with places along the North Gulf Coast getting above freezing to around 34 degrees. Then in the mid to upper 30s for much of the Panhandle for Friday afternoon. For Saturday morning, dropping down into the teens for many of the more inland locations as we get into the Panhandle. More towards the Gulf, we are going to stay up in the upper 20s. As we get into the south central area, dropping down into the teens for many locations. Some places getting a little bit lower into the single digits, Anchorage up towards Talkeetna. And then Glen Allen staying way down there, down all the way to minus 14 degrees. Negatives for all of central and eastern parts of the interior, and that does go up into the north slope as well, all below zero up there. But as we get further to the west, we are going to see some warmer temps only dropping down into the teens along the coastline, into the 20s as we get into the YK Delta coastline, and then into the 20s for the Bristol Bay area as well, and dropping down into the mid-30s, not quite getting below freezing, expected for Saturday morning along the Aleutians. Then into Saturday afternoon, getting up into the mid to upper 30s as we move into the Aleutian Islands and then around the Bristol Bay and YK Delta areas, right at around freezing. And then as we move further to the north, only in the mid to upper 20s there. Along the Arctic coastline, getting above 0, but staying in the single digits for the most part. And that's going to be true for the northern parts of the interior. However, as we get closer towards Fairbanks area, central interior, getting up into the teens and into the mid 20s for much of south central Alaska, with right around freezing for many locations in the Panhandle. Some places further down by Ketchikan area going to get up to around 38 degrees. So we'll take a quick break and go back to the aviation portion.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off looking out over the main part of the state where we do have some areas of cloud cover and fog in the morning. That's going to bring some MVFR and IFR conditions to much of the interior. Our front pushing across southwest Alaska, also bringing in some MVFR and IFR conditions along the Arctic coastline. Also having some lower cloud cover up there with some MVFR and IFR conditions, and the southern portions of the Panhandle are going to see some MVFR conditions, and way up north towards the Haines and Skagway area, some MVFR conditions there expected as well on Friday morning. So look out further to the west, we have our system pushing into the western part of the Bering Sea, bringing some MVFR and isolated areas of IFR out there in the morning. Then we are going to see this extend out a little bit further to the east, bringing those MVFR conditions further towards the central part of the Bering Sea. But as we look across much of mainland Alaska, a lot of that fog and stratus has diminished throughout the interior. We do have remnants of our front pushing through the western portion of the state, bringing some MVFR conditions around the Seward Peninsula and Norton Sound area, and then up along the Arctic coastline, some remaining MVFR conditions there. And then with our system out in the Gulf, we are going to see some MVFR conditions primarily out over the Gulf, but extending somewhat over Kodiak Island area. However, much of the Panhandle area going to clear up as we move into Friday afternoon. Then on Saturday morning, going to have some redevelopment of lower sea lanes out through much of the interior. So we're going to see return of MVFR and IFR conditions into Saturday morning. And that's going to extend along much of the western part of the state with some isolated areas of IFR conditions in the YK Delta area and up north of the Kotzebue Sound as we get into the western portions of the Brooks Range. Up along the Arctic coastline, also going to see some MVFR conditions on Saturday morning, and then out over much of the central part of the Bering Sea down into the Aleutian Islands, MVFR conditions expected there. As we move into the afternoon time, we watch this front push further into the eastern parts of the Bering Sea. We are going to see some MVFR and IFR conditions there, extending down over the Alaska Peninsula and eastern part of the Aleutian Islands. Way over the western Aleutians, also going to see some MVFR conditions there. Southern portions of mainland Alaska should be VFR throughout Saturday afternoon, but as we get into the interior and some areas along the Arctic coastline, we are expecting to see some MVFR conditions there. However, in the Panhandle should be nice and VFR conditions throughout Saturday afternoon. Taking a look now at our passes, AKwx should be VFR throughout the day on Friday, as well as Adigan Pass. Moving further to the south, Lake Clark and Merrill will both start off marginal conditions but improve to VFR later in the afternoon. Rainy Pass should be VFR throughout the day on Friday, as well as Windy Pass, Isabel Pass, and Mentasta Pass all should be VFR throughout the day Friday. Looking down, we have Tanita Pass also going to be VFR, and Portage should also be visual flight rules. As we move to Chilkoot and White, starting off with marginal conditions, improving to VFR in the afternoon time. For our freezing levels on Friday morning, our surface freezing line hugging the Panhandle area up along the North Gulf Coast and then out into the eastern part of the Bering Sea and up further to the north. We have some areas with some warmer air being pulled up by the low moving through the Gulf of Alaska, with some of those higher freezing levels there. And then out to the west, we have another little area of some southerly flow bringing up some of those warmer freezing levels as well. Looking out at our icing as expected with a system moving out into the western part of the Bering Sea. We have a lot of icing out there with that system below 8,000 feet expected, with the front extending across the western portion of the state below 5,000 feet there. And as we drop down to where the main low pressure center is in the Gulf, we do have between 1,000 and 5,000 feet for icing there. Out to the eastern portions of the Panhandle between 2,000 and 5,000 feet, and then a smaller area up by the Kaktovik area of between 3,000 and 8,000 feet. Looking at our jet stream, we have one jet streak coming into the eastern part of the state, dropping down at northwesterly direction, 70 knots, but picking up pretty fast to 150 knots just to the east of the Panhandle. As we look out over the western areas, we do have a portion of the jet coming in over the western Aleutian Islands out of a southwesterly direction, 145 knots, but diminishing to down around to 100 knots out of a northerly direction over the west coast of the state, and then merging back in to the south of the Panhandle area, about 115 knots. Dropping down to 9,000 feet, we have southwesterly flow out over much of the Aleutian Islands and central and western parts of the Bering Sea. Flow anywhere from 25 to 40 knots, getting up to as high as 75 knots out of those central areas, but then dropping back down again as we get into this ridging. Moving out over the main part of the state, we do have a southerly flow, 30 to 35 knots along the west coast, becoming westerly, and then northerly as we get to the central and eastern locations, only around 10 to 20 knots there, and then around 15 to 20 knots over the Panhandle area of a northwesterly direction. Out over the Alaska Panhandle or Peninsula, we do have northwesterly flow picking up to as high as 55 knots out over the peninsula. As we drop down to 3,000 feet, we have a really weak flow over much of mainland Alaska except for the northeastern part of the state, around 20 knots out of a northwesterly direction. Flow along the west coast primarily southerly, 25 to 35 knots, getting up to as high as 55 knots as we drop down to the eastern portions of the Bering Sea, and up to as high as 65 knots, getting a little bit further to the west, and then diminishing as we get further to the west. Taking a look at our turbulence now all along the Aleutian Islands, we are expecting turbulence below 3,000 feet there. So we move into the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island area, below 4,000 feet expected for those locations. Around the Seward Peninsula up towards the Kotzebue Sound area, below 4,000 feet expected there, and below 5,000 feet in the Panhandle. We'll be right back with the rain forecast.
Return of the Moon Joke episode. Hey there, stargazers. I'm Dehne Regas, astronomer with the Cincinnati Observatory.
And I'm James Albury, director of the Kika Silva Pla Planetarium in Gainesville, Florida. We're here to help you find your way around the sky.
And this week to share some space jokes, specifically about the moon, since you'll be able to see it after dark each night next week.
Dehne is a total lunatic about bad jokes, so just humor him.
We have some gems like, what holds up the moon?
What?
Moonbeams, of course. I've got a million of them.
Well, more like 5 or 6 of them. But as we wax on about the moon and show you what's up in the sky, we know that your interest will not wane.
Let's show you.
Okay, how does the moon cut his hair?
I know, eclipse it.
Ooh, one of the worst jokes ever. But that makes me think about eclipses, and we hope you saw the most recent lunar eclipse on January 31st.
It was awesome. When the moon completely enters the shadow of the Earth, it turns all shades of gray and orange.
If you missed it, the next one will be visible in the United States on January 20th of next year. Lunar eclipses can only occur at full moons and only when the sun, Earth, and moon line up just right.
You know, James, the moon's parents were really worried about him.
Ooh, is this another joke?
Yep. Every new moon, he disappeared. His dad panicked, but his mom understood. She reassured him, don't worry, honey, it's just a phase he's going through.
Bravo, Mr. Regas, bravo. But that reminds me, you can only have a solar eclipse during a new moon. And the next really good solar eclipse in the United States will be on October 14th, 2023. Hey, Dehne, why couldn't the astronauts stay overnight on the moon?
Why?
Because it was full.
Now you're getting into the swing of it.
Anyway, we will have our next full moon on March 1st. You can see it rising in the east just as the sun sets in the west that day.
Okay, James, how do you know when the moon's going broke?
How?
It's down to its last quarter. When the moon appears halfway lit up, we actually call that a quarter moon. It sounds confusing, since how can a half moon be a quarter? But the name really refers to its motion around the Earth.
On the night of February 22nd, you can see the right half of the moon lit up. We call that first quarter, since it has traveled 1/4 of the way around the Earth from its new moon phase. That night, the first quarter moon will be in the constellation Taurus and near the Seven Sisters star cluster.
On the morning of March 9th, you'll see the left half of the moon illuminated. We call that third quarter or last quarter, and it'll be near the planet Mars. Yep, we went a long way for that joke.
So Dehne, what do you think of that restaurant on the moon?
Meh, the food was great, but it has no atmosphere.
It's true. Unlike the Earth, the moon has no significant atmosphere. So when the Apollo astronauts visited the moon, they had to wear spacesuits like these. Hey, there's Buzz Aldrin. Hey, Buzz.
Hey, James, he can't hear you. There's no air out there. However, Buzz and 11 other astronauts walked on the surface of the moon between 1969 and 1972. Buzz Aldrin described the moon as magnificent desolation, and it certainly is desolate. Everywhere you look are dark-colored rocks and more dark-colored rocks. I know the moon seems bright, but most of the moon rocks are the color of asphalt.
On the last 3 Apollo missions, astronauts brought up moon rovers to drive across the lunar surface. The rovers were battery-powered and could reach a top speed of 8 miles per hour. You can't drive that slow on Earth, or else.
Or else what?
Or else you'll have to apologize.
Nice.
So, every night this week, check out the moon after dark.
Get a group together and moon gaze with friends and family. And if you want to organize the best star party ever, we have some words of advice.
You better plan it.
Definitely don't moon it. Keep looking up.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back to the marine forecast. We'll start off with a quick look at the ice edge. Starting off over the west coast, we do have a lot of warm air coming up from the south, so we have seen a lot of diminishment of the ice edge. In some areas, it has pushed back to the north 10 to 20 miles. And we do have a continued flow from the south over the next several days that is going to bring back or push back the ice edge even further. Out over Cook Inlet, however, not a lot of change. Some fluctuations with the tide as expected through the Cook Inlet area, but the overall ice is not growing or diminishing any significant amount in the last 24 hours. As we move out towards the main marine forecast, we'll start off in the southeast of the state. Primarily northerly flow, anywhere from 15 to 30 knots in the inside waters. We are seeing northerly flow still in the far eastern parts of the Gulf, but that is going to switch as we have flow coming in from the southeast, and you can already see some of the areas further to the north switching on Friday, and then on Saturday, I'll be coming northerly again, getting up to as high as 35 knots south of Craig in the inside waters, up to as high as 45 knots out of that northerly direction, closer up towards Skagway. Then on Friday for the south central area, we do have easterly to northeast flow, 10 to 20 knots, weaker as we get into Prince William Sound, only around 10 knots there, and up to small craft level at 25 knots as we get to the east of the Barren Islands. Up in Cook Inlet, seeing 10 to 20 knots with the lower speeds as we get further to the north. Seas about 5 or 6 feet out in the Gulf. Then on Saturday, we're seeing flow primarily out of a northerly direction, 25 knots around the Barren Islands up into the southern parts of Cook Inlet. A little bit weaker as we get closer to Prince William Sound, 15 to 20 knots there. Seas still around 5 to 6 feet on Saturday. As we look to the Alaska Peninsula, primarily northerly flow or northwesterly flow, weaker in the northern locations, 25 to 30 knots, but as we get around Kodiak Island, especially the southern locations, 35 to 40 knots there, and then switching up and becoming southerly as we get to the northern parts of the Alaska Peninsula, around 20 knots there. Then on Saturday, many locations becoming much more southeasterly as we have this front pushing in from the west, getting up to as high as 40 knots in the more westerly locations, diminishing and changing direction as we get around Kodiak Island, around 15 to 20 knots there. Then on Friday for the Aleutian Islands, we do have flow up to as high as 50 knots, storm force winds there, and we are going to see that flow continuing for the central Aleutians out through the western Aleutians, diminishing as we get closer to Shimmy, around 40 knots there. Seas getting up to as high as 29 feet to the west of Adak, and dropping down as we get further to the east, 25 to 30 knots there on Friday. All winds diminishing as we get into Saturday, with the exception of near the eastern Aleutian Islands, 40 to 45 knots out of that southeasterly direction, becoming southwesterly as we get further to the west, 15 to 20 knots there. Seas dropping down to 16 to 19 feet out west, up to as high as 23 feet further to the east. Along the west coast of the state, primarily southerly flow, weaker up north, around 15 knots there, but getting as high as 40 knots as we get down by St. Matthew Island and by the Pribilof Islands. Then on Saturday, flow becoming more southeasterly, 35 to 40 knots there from Nunavik Island out by the Pribilof Islands as well, diminishing as we get further to the north once again, dropping down to around 20 knots as we get closer towards the Bering Strait. Then along the northern west part of the state, up along the Arctic coastline as well, out by the Kotzebue Sound area, southeasterly flow 25 to 30 knots there, but diminishing and changing to northwesterly along the Arctic coastline, 5 to 15 knots there. So we look into Saturday, southerly flow along the west coast, 25 to 30 knots, and that's going to diminish as we get closer towards Barrow, dropping down to 5 to 15 knots and switching to becoming more westerly as we get closer towards Kaktovik. Quick recap for the state. We have a couple systems moving through. One is pushing a front through the western part of the state, bringing snow to areas around Bristol Bay up towards the Norton Sound area, and some areas of blowing snow in the Kotzebue Sound area, and especially along the coastline from Point Hope down through the Bering Strait and St. Lawrence Island, seeing snow and blowing snow conditions through much of tonight and into tomorrow. As we move out further to the west, we have another system over the western Aleutian Islands, bringing some rain to the central Aleutian Islands as that system starts to move in, and high pressure building in from the North Pacific. Another area of high pressure out over the eastern part of mainland Alaska, bringing fog to the interior overnight. Some isolated areas of snow still lingering around the northeastern part of the state. Panhandle going to be pretty dry. Moving into Friday, that system's starting to make its way to the Panhandle, but still going to see clear conditions out there, as well as south central Alaska and much of the interior on Friday as well, with this high pressure pushing in from the west. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. I want to thank you for being with us tonight.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.